Library. Thank you for joining us at this annual reception to honor Rice authors and editors and composers and artists. It's actually one of the high points of the year for me. My name is Caldwell. I'm a professor of history. I'd like to welcome all of our members and all of our guests to tonight's event. Tonight we will honor those members of the Rice community who have contributed published works to the arts and to the sciences, to the humanities in 2022. After recognizing each honoree, I will introduce our panelists for the evening, and I'll moderate a discussion of the theme for the evening, namely immigration, inequality, and climate change, human realities, and policy options. So at that point, I'll open the floor to questions. I don't know, we'll have to only have about 10 minutes for questions, I'm afraid, because we had to start a little late. And then, of course, there'll be a reception, which is the most important part, where you can continue talking also to our authors. Okay, so now comes the magical part of the evening, where we see whether the technology works. After COVID, we have no faith anymore. Okay, great. So, I want to go through, we have a long list, as happens every year. Rice University produces a whole lot of stuff, and in all different areas. The first is Ed Aiken, Finite Element Analysis with Numeric and Symbolic MATLAB. Ed's an old friend of mine. I don't know what it's about. In any case, I'm very glad to see it produced. Owen Amaden, with others, A Child's First Prayer to Divine Administrative Services from this past year. Marcia Brennan, A Rose from Two Gardens, Saint Therese of Lisieux, and Images at the End of Life from the University of California's Medical Humanities Press. Luis Campos, who's back there somewhere, co-authored a book, Nature Remade, Engineering Life, Envisioning Worlds, from the University of Chicago Press. Daniel Cohan will be talking later on today, Confronting Climate Gridlock, How Diplomacy, Technology, and Policy Can Unlock a Clean Energy Future, from Yale. Stephen DeLay has actually 5 different contributions this year, dealing with everything. Volume 1, Anomie, Everything. Volume 2, Kings of the Earth, the second part of Everything. The Desolate. Elijah Newman died today. And In the Spirit, A Phenomenology of Faith. So, amazing year for Stephen DeLay. Marlene Dressler, Our Eyes at Night, The Last Ghost Series, Book 3 from Arcade. David Fisher, with others, Dynamics, Geometry, Number Theory, The Impact of Margulis on Modern Mathematics, from the University of Chicago Press. Stephen Fox and Paul Hester, The Architecture of Beardsall B. Briscoe, Melissa Fu, Peach Blossom Spring, from Little Brown and Company. Christine Galeb, Etched in Stone, from Road Less Traveled Enterprises. Biko Mandela, Black Lives Matter, from Duke University Press. We have a long list, people. I mean, this is really an outstanding year. Oops. Zara Jamal, who talked here a few years ago, has produced something called Justice's Mission, an Islamic View of Individual, Social, and Institutional Duties, in an important edited volume on world religions and their missions, from Peter Lang. Lacey Johnson, More City Than Water, a Houston Flood Atlas, from the University of Texas Press. Yunichiro Kono, Quantum Mechanics for Tomorrow's Engineers. James Lawler, In the Twinkling of an Eye, a novel of biological terror and espionage, from BookBee. Ashley Leeds, with Michaela Matis, Domestic Interests, Democracy, and Foreign Policy Change, from Cambridge University Press.
Wrong.
I was just trying to fool you.
Lawler had 2 books.
Okay. But I can see here a little bit. Tony Nikos with Jonah S. Timenoff. Biomaterials, the intersection of biological and material sciences. Elizabeth Cummins Muñoz, Mothercoin, the stories of immigrant nannies, and she's also going to be talking later on tonight. Anna Rhodes, also will be talking later on tonight, Soaking the Middle Class, Suburban Inequality and Recovery from Disaster from Russell Sage. Christopher Sperandio, who's actually spoke last year, read, why, and...
Political behalf.
Thank you. Anyway, Paul Stevenson, Renormalized Perturbation Theory and its Optimization by the Principle of Minimal Sensitivity from World Scientific Publishers. Tron, High-Speed System and Analog Input-Output Design from Springer. Jesus Pasayo, Nueva Vivienda, New Housing Paradigms in Mexico from Park Books. Ivio Jan van der Werf, A Notebook for Viola Players. Anna Marie Womack, Inclusive College Classrooms, Teaching Methods for Diverse Learners from Rutledge. We have to also then mention now the editors of books and journals. A very important job, editor, right? So someone actually has to get these things into press. Leslie Marie Aguilar, Managing Editor of SEL, Studies in English Literature. Bradford served as guest editor of Midwest Studies in Philosophy, a special issue on well-being and ill-being. Elizabeth Brake, editor of the Journal of Applied Philosophy. Logan Browning, I believe I saw you here, I'm not sure. He's a publisher and executive editor of Studies in English Literature. Joseph Campana, editor of the earlier period of Studies in English Literature. Christian Elden edits Nietzsche Studies, or Nietzsche Studien. Randall Hewlett is in the board of reviewing editors for Science. Raya Kriegel is the editor of Oxford Studies in the Philosophy of Mind. Ashley Leeds edits International Organization. Ankit Patil was the guest associate editor for Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience and the topic editors for Symmetry as a Guiding Principle in Artificial and Brain Neural Networks. George Phillips, editor-in-chief of Structural Dynamics. Alexander Regier, Studies in English Literature. Paul Spanos was editor-in-chief of Journal of Probabilistic Mechanics and editor-in-chief of Journal of Nonlinear Mechanics. Evelyn Tang on the editorial board of Communications Physics. Laszlo Tiani, editorial review board of the Academy of Management Review, of Management Journal, excuse me. Robert Vashtai is editor-in-chief of Oxford Open Materials Science. So quite a lot of work in the editorial world from the university right now. Karam Al-Sand, who just performed, as you may know, as a CD, The Leader in Other Works. Norman Fisher with Jean Kierman Fisher, 2020 Vision, so we're talking about composers now. Last but not least, Arthur Gottschalk is here. Loser, The Wit and Wisdom of Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. No, that's not you, Arthur. It is you. Performed by the Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble. We have to hear that. So, congratulations to all these people who've done so much in so many areas. I'm really excited this year because of the breadth. We really are getting the science stuff out there. So let's give everyone who... Okay. We're going to now move to our panel discussion. I'd like to invite the panelists to come on up, if you would. We're going to have to share microphones. We only have two. So, I'd like to briefly start by introducing each of our panelists. As you saw, we had a whole lot of people to choose from. And one of the things that I try to do in this is actually to find books that are both very different, but also overlap so we can develop some kind of conversation. I think that's what we'll be able to do well this time. I was not sure how to present them. I thought I'd do something really original and do it by alphabetical order, right? So I want to begin down at the end with Daniel Cohan. He's Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Rice. He works on the air, on modeling atmospheric change, especially with respect to major pollutants, on connecting that empirical research to energy policy, health policy, and air quality management. Dan is active in many ways in pursuing this agenda. Certainly he's active in print media and digital media. He's also serving on the EPA's Board of Scientific Counselors. He's authored many articles on matters ranging from ozone and nitrous oxide pollution to the effects of closing coal plants. And he's a committed and passionate teacher, as is everyone on this panel. That was another criterion that I took into account. His book, Confronting Climate Gridlock, as I said, appeared with Yale University Press this year. I have an opening question for you, Dan. I've been doing this panel for some time now, and one thing we hardly ever see is books written from the natural sciences and engineers that we can bring into the discussion. There's something, this is not the normal book that I would associate with what comes from your side of campus. Why this book? Why a whole book? Why not actually articles or blog entries? What made you write this thing?
Yeah. Thanks, Carl. Appreciate being here and appreciate the question. Yeah, it's not something that we usually see. Probably the most common question that I got when I said I was going to be writing this book was, one, is your department chair okay with that? And two, is your dean okay with that? So the assumption that this isn't something that on my side of the campus we do. But it was actually a previous dean who got me thinking in this lines, is that when Dean Ned Thomas handed me the letter of getting tenure, he said, now what are you actually going to do with this? I realized, okay, it doesn't have to always, with that academic freedom, it doesn't have to always be everything written for just fellow atmospheric scientists, for fellow, few dozen readers of very technical writing. And it actually had a background in journalism, the high school newspaper and college newspaper, and the brief time of Dallas Morning News. And so I thought, let's try to actually write in English again, and something that people other than scientists and engineers can read. And so over the course of writing a number of op-eds and taking what are the lessons of this work for Houston Chronicle and the Conversation and The Hill, I think many of us at Rice were sort of always looking for a new challenge and realized there was a lot that I wanted to say that needed a lot more than 750 words to say it. And so some of the ideas that I was able to develop over the course of these op-eds ended up leading to writing this book.
Can I follow up really briefly on that? So it's a wonderful book, and it pulls a lot of stuff together. Is there a reason why you want to have all the stuff here together in one place? That makes sense.
Yeah, it was something I had no idea how to write a book, and so went about writing a book proposal and ended up throwing 3 rounds of it in the trash can before coming up with this version. So it came through a lot of different ways. Originally, this was going to be climate of opportunities. It was going to be looking at success stories of how people were profiting from businesses that just happened to be doing things that reduced emissions and improved our efforts to fight climate change. And then the first person I went to actually in downtown Houston, Michael Skelly, said, well, who's making any money of this? And then ends up, by the time I was finished with the book, he had to close his company without building a single one of the power lines he wanted to build. So in the course of researching it, I realized we can't just see it as a business pursuit. We can't just see it as something in the marketplace, but it really depends on having policies in place that make this possible. It depends on having diplomacy in place that pulls together the policies of different countries. And so decided that I really needed to focus on these 3 dimensions, that only by looking at diplomacy and policy together with the technology that's the core, being an engineer focused the most on technology, but needed all 3 of those keys to be able to unlock what needs to be done.
Our second panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Cummins Muñoz. Dr. Cummins Muñoz is a scholar of Latin American and U.S. Hispanic literature. She's published not only commentary on literature, but also her own fiction. Elizabeth is course director in, I have certain predilections here, in our fabulous first-year writing program, where she's also a committed, a patient, and respected teacher. Her book, Mothercoin, The Stories of Immigrant Nannies, appeared last year with Beacon Press. and has received national attention, including an interview on national public radio. So my opening question for you, Elizabeth, you have to take the mic here. You are a very careful reader. You're a very careful writer, so reader. You no doubt thought a lot about that word. The first word in your book, right, is Mothercoin. What does that word mean, and why do you begin with it?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So that word came to me to help me communicate kind of an understanding that I came to working with the stories. So this book is a collection of stories that were told to me by immigrant nannies that I met and sought out here in Houston, but it began very organically in the park, taking care of my kids. And I was drawn to their stories for a number of different reasons, but one particular common storyline really drew me, which was the situation in which a woman finds herself needing to leave her family and her children home in her home country in order to travel here, in this case to Houston, work at this kind of mothering labor and care work in order to earn wages to then send back and care for her children. And what really struck me about that was that it asks someone to determine the relative value of different ways of being a mother. And as I worked more and more with these stories, I realized that choice, that conflict, that kind of negotiation of value comes up again and again, not just with the transnational mothers, but even the care, the actual work that you do for wages that involving like the direct care, the taking care of the child, the bathing, and elder care, disabled care as well. This generates like this real emotional bond. And, but it's all kind of transcribed in this confusing transactional work arrangement. So Mothercoin kind of speaks to this negotiation of value that happens in their lives, but very much in their stories, when they're telling their stories and trying to make sense of their experiences. And one more thing that I'll add about the term Mothercoin that I appreciate is that it kind of lifts up this awareness that we really attribute a lot of value, a lot of moral value to this ideal of mother as this kind of selfless, always present, emotionally available figure, and that ideal very much resists commodification. But at the same time, we really dismiss the productive, real, substantial economic value of mothering labor, that work of social reproduction that drives migration, it drives this entire shadow industry, and the women feel this very intimately.
Thank you. So, if there is one thing that connects immigration and climate change, it's flooding and the disasters that are occurring. And our third author actually addressed such a disaster, Harvey. Our third panelist is Professor Rhodes, Assistant Professor of Sociology. She's a specialist on urban sociology, the sociology of education, and environmental sociology. You might first think, okay, 3 different areas, but in fact they come together in her central concern about how households work, how decisions are made under conditions of residential inequality, of inequality of education, and unequal exposure to environmental risk. In other words, as I said, work is related to what both Dan and Elizabeth are doing, but coming at the material from a sociological perspective. And his new book, co-authored with Max Besbris, is entitled Soaking the Middle Class, a nice title, by the way. Suburban Inequality and the Recovery from Disaster. It appeared last year, as I said, with the Russell Sage Foundation. Anna, you're connecting class inequality, residential space, and disaster. There's a lot of different variables here. Why do you need so many variables? How are you putting this together?
Yeah, I'm building on an existing body of work that has shown us that in the wake of disasters, we see amplified inequality. So the inequality that exists before a disaster strikes often grows in the wake. And most scholarship has looked a lot at how we see differences between sort of affluent communities and poor communities in the wake of a disaster. But Hurricane Harvey was pretty broad in its scope of impact across different types of communities in the Houston area and the Gulf Coast more broadly, which meant that there were a lot of more affluent communities that were now having to navigate disaster recovery. And climate change suggests that that's going to continue to be true for an increasing number of middle class and more affluent communities in the future. So we wanted to understand with this book how middle class households navigate decision making in the wake of disaster, and whether the processes that we see between communities in terms of amplified inequality are replicated even within a more affluent middle class space, the kind of residential community that we might think of as a best case scenario for being resilient in the wake of a storm. So we did that through 2 years of multiple interviews with 59 households that flooded in one middle class suburban community outside of Houston, looking at how families made the decision about whether to rebuild and return to their homes or sell and move. What financial considerations they were navigating as they did that. And then once they made that choice, what did that process look like? How did that unfold over time? And ultimately, we do find that even in these more affluent spaces, middle class communities impacted by flooding, we see amplified inequality between residents within that space. So at the end of our 2-year period of talking to folks, we saw some residents who had completely rebuilt their homes. They were living in homes that are now up to 2017 code. They were able to make some repairs that make their home more the way they wanted it to be before the flood. And some were able to do that without spending every dollar of their insurance payout, sometimes adding to their savings. And then there were neighbors, sometimes just doors down, who didn't have their flooring complete, whose kitchens weren't done yet 2 years later. So within this community, we saw this growing gulf between the sort of more affluent members of the community and the less affluent members of the community, even within this middle class space. So it took sort of pulling together, thinking about middle classness, thinking about where people live and why they decide to live there, and thinking about inequality to sort of unpack that story.
That's great. It's a really interesting book. It's interesting for a lot of reasons. One is that you're also, it's not your primary focus, but you're exploring the culture, right? The cultural expressions in a middle class household. So one of the things you note is there's huge differences in financial ability, huge inequalities which seem to be not always expressed. That leads me to a question which, again, not exactly what you're doing, but it does relate. It relates, we're turning now to a second round of questions. It relates to what everyone is doing here a little bit. You're describing the area that's been especially hard hit by flooding, and really unprecedented flooding down there in Redwood. It's making FEMA revise its maps. And through the entire book, what I really noticed was not much politics. And whether that was because of the questions you were asking, or whether it comes out of the other aspects of this notion of being part of the middle class community that you were talking about. What's going on here? Friendswood has as its congressional representative Randy Weber, whose voting record is quite opposed to environmental and environmental policies, conservationist policies, including policies related to climate change. And that's some of the people voting for him. I know you're working as a sociologist, so it's kind of an unfair question. But my question, we have no judgments here. The question is, how would you relate the stuff that you're looking at the social level with this political emanation?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one we've been getting about this book, thinking about Friendswood as a pretty conservative suburban community. It was interesting, I think the period that we spoke to people after your home floods, the 2 years after your home floods, the bandwidth people have for anything other than trying to get their home back together was almost zero. So we weren't having big political debates. We were having debates about like how you decide what floor tile to order and whether you change it if it's going to be back. Or like the nuance of trying to get your home back together was top of mind and often the only thing people had bandwidth for. That said, it was notable to us talking to people over multiple interviews that people almost never brought up climate change. Like that phrase almost never came up in the interviews. And I think part of that is the politicized nature of discussion about climate change. People didn't want to like crack into that, and I'm sure they made assumptions about what my view might be, and they probably thought I would make assumptions about what their views might be. So it didn't really come up. Risk, how I thought about risk, and like whether my home might flood again was top of mind for people. But in the last wave of interviews, we really explicitly asked people what they thought about climate change, wanting to understand sort of how they were thinking about that and how that might relate to ways that they would think about what they wanted out of their local government and their federal government. And we saw really heterogeneous views. So within this community, the vote's pretty conservative. There were folks who were saying, you know, I think human activity is leading to global warming and climate change, and that's increasing my risk. And then you had people who were like, I don't know what to think about that. You hear all kinds of different things, like, I don't know what to think. And then there was a third group of people who were saying, I don't think human activity has anything to do with climate change, and therefore has nothing to do with my changing risk. Across all three groups, everyone was doing the same thing. They were all rebuilding their homes in Brentwood. So those varied views weren't really driving action when it came to decisions about whether to return and rebuild in the wake of this flood, even though the flood had just revealed their homes to be vulnerable. You couldn't deny the vulnerability of the potential that it might flood again. So one of the things that I sort of take away from that is that I actually think there might be more shared common ground about how people think about what we should be doing than our politicized conversation about climate change makes space for. Everyone was talking about the way that development might impact runoff and flood risk, what types of mitigation steps they hoped the city government would take, all of those kinds of things. There was a lot of common ground, even among people who had really different articulations of what they thought about climate change. So we have to engage the political conversations. We can't avoid the term entirely or not talk about how we're thinking about that, and our policies have to reflect that risk might not remain the same, right? We're in a context where flood risk will look different in the future. But one thing from that conversation that I took away is across people who might think differently, and that issue might appear highly polarizing in our politicized conversation, there's actually a lot more shared perspective than I think we often hear talked about.
It's so interesting. This is one point. Occasionally we have arguments at the university about why have departments. We have departments because you have the sociological approach leads to different kinds of outcomes, different kinds of knowledge, which is exactly what you're putting forward. I want to go back to Dan now, actually, because this is related to, I think what I talked to you about the first time I really talked to you at length, which is when you were hosting an event for a North Texas political candidate, you were advising her on environmental issues. And she told us at that event that in her district, she simply doesn't use the phrase climate change. Your book is calling for a bunch of policies that are dealing with climate change. That is a key issue. It's a highly political issue. Gridlocks are your title. You're aiming to overcome gridlock. How do you hope your book contributes to overcoming political gridlock if political candidates can't even use the phrase in their districts?
Yeah, well, I think very much like what Anna found in her community she was looking at, that people had very different politics, very different views of the science, but they still wanted to do about the same things. And we see that in the policy debate too, that support for wind and solar power are extremely high, even huge amounts of support across the spectrum of voters. We see that a far higher percentage of voters say that the government should be regulating carbon dioxide emissions than accept the science that carbon dioxide is even warming the planet. I don't understand the disconnect. Why should we regulate it if it's not a problem? But there is a lot of common ground in terms of agreeing with the solutions that we should be pursuing. And so as much as I wish the answer came from the atmospheric chemistry and climate classes that I teach, so that we just had the science better understood, or some of the messages and recommendations of the book could be better understood. In many ways, when I talk to political candidates, when I talk to Congress people or state legislatures, and when they're trying to do it, is how do we get away from the buzzwords? How do we get away most recently with the flap over gas stoves, which got people all up in arms about that? How do you get it away from being such a charged issue and make it in ways that's what everyone can agree on? That we want the lights to stay on, we want them to be affordable, we want them to be reliable, we want clean air, we want clean water, and so how can we show that the things that we need to do to achieve what we all want can also be done in ways that help to rein in climate change?
That's fascinating. When I was reading these books, I was noticing that all three of them have a theme of silence, of things that aren't said. And the same thing happens in Elizabeth's books. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about writing. All these books are really nice and fun to read, but I'm going to concentrate especially on one passage that you write. Pardon me for reading to you. It's because I'm a teacher. That's what I'm paid to do, to read to people. This is a discussion talking about a dinner table conversation. And as Elizabeth writes, a dinner table falls silent when a woman of the house begins to explain the ambivalence of her position alone. And I really want you to listen carefully. Every once in a while I'm just struck by phrases, and they stick in my head. And this one paragraph, a brief section of it, especially, the realities of the Mothercoin inhabit these silences and seep into the words we use. I love that. Seeping into the words we use. Example, I'm looking for someone to help me clean, we might say, a girl to come in and watch the kids for me. Rather than hiring an employee, we seek a vague someone always there to help. Because in the world of discourse and meaning that ignores the reality of the servant class and understands women's work as immaterial to larger economic forces, the outsourcing of such work is wrapped up in the language of consumption. And this last sentence in particular, that I'll be quite good. Families with real needs find themselves negotiating an industry with unspoken rules and vaguely defined practices, and cloaked in a hazy sense of entitlement that belies the urgency of their situation. What I really found striking about that, you've got a really complicated set of things here. You're talking about contradictions on multiple levels on the part of the nannies or the houseworkers, the house attendants, but also on the part of the people doing the employment. Both sides in need. This has to do with the difficulty among working middle-class women of talking about a certain kind of labor, so there's a discussion of certain things that are not said. So my question is a little different from the other two. It's about writing. That's what you teach. As you write, how do you manage to compress so much really hard ideas into such vivid and beautiful language? Does it come like that?
Yes, it's really easy. Thank you, and thank you for your kind words and for reading that passage. And for this question, because I do teach writing, and I spend a lot of time thinking about writing, and my answer comes in many ways from a very acute awareness of things like audience and purpose, and narrative, power of narrative. But my first answer is it was really hard. Like, it was really hard to write everything into this book, and it clocked in at twice the word count, the contracted word count, and then cut it away. But my goal throughout was to get this into the hands of my neighbors, book clubs, people who hire these women, and sort of much speaking a little bit to the conversation we were having about, silences around politics, and everybody really kind of agreeing on what needs to be done. The reality is, knowing these stories and knowing them the way I did reveals a complexity that makes it very hard to reduce conversations around immigration and motherhood and childcare to kind of two sides. So in terms of the idea of sort of compressing the language, my goal was really to foreground narrative and allow kind of the research and the analysis to be a scaffolding, and then let that scaffolding fall away so that what remained was a story that was very much formed by the analysis. And I'll also say that it was very important for me to tell the story that I ethically could tell, which was mine. It was the story of me knowing these women. And when I was interviewing them and meeting them, I was also studying for my doctorate, so I was learning about regional contexts. I was learning about kind of their histories. I was learning about the testimonial genre. And what I tried to do was tell a story about me knowing them and making sense of their experiences, which is to a certain extent what the concept of the Mothercoin encapsulates.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Anna here, actually, or Anna, sorry, because also we talked about the unsaid, but there's also these things that you were pointing out, other moments of complexity and contradiction for middle-class households. One in particular has to do with the term, with how you ask for help or receive help in an emergency situation. And you use a term called social infrastructure to describe the different ways, different sources that can actually help someone recover, or a family to recover from such an extreme situation. But the social infrastructure you describe is also complex and contains contradictions, also silences about what is to be asked and what not to be asked. So I wonder if you might say a few words on this idea of social infrastructure, which I found so fascinating in the book.
Yeah, so social infrastructure captures sort of a combination of places and people. We could think of a library as a place of social infrastructure. It creates things like this, where we can come together and connect with one another. I'm sure we'll meet people tonight that I would not have met otherwise. And this space is important to our capacity to create those connections. So within communities, we have different forms of social infrastructure. You have libraries, you have churches, you have schools, you have civic organizations, all kinds of things. You do a combination of pulling people together and providing space for those kinds of activities. That social infrastructure becomes incredibly important when something like a flood hits your community. The church becomes the shelter or the staging ground for a food operation that serves meals to people, right? The church also becomes a place where the women's group become people who go out to volunteer mucking out homes, right? It creates this context in which people can offer help and receive it. And what we find in this book is that the community we studied had a really robust social infrastructure. It's part of what makes it a place where we might think of as a best case scenario for recovery. There are all of these resources that you could draw upon within that space. And FEMA assumes those resources exist in communities and expects our reliance upon them. None of the FEMA dollars are intended, like if you don't have flood insurance, the FEMA aid that you receive is not intended to be able to cover the full repair of your home. There's a strong expectation that communities are going to be a source of additional support to help close the gap if people are returning between what FEMA dollars can cover and what you actually need to get back into a safe and habitable home. So there's this expectation that there's going to be some gap filling that happens and that the community is going to fill that role. And what we find is that it was really hard for middle-class households to ask for help. They described themselves as givers, not receivers of assistance. They were often the ones donating things or doing volunteering as opposed to receiving the assistance. So there was this big shift that was required when all of a sudden you were the person who needed help. And you had to be willing to ask for it or say yes if someone offered it to you. And the social infrastructure played a big role in the extent to which people were able to make that shift and what it looked like. And it was not static. It changed over time as the social infrastructure changed. So as everybody showed up, maybe some of you did this, showed up to volunteer to muck out people's homes, one of the respondents told us they needed a traffic director in their neighborhood because there were so many cars, you couldn't get in and out. There's so many volunteers. In that context, it seemed like every single person in the community was either helping or being helped, which meant that receiving help was like not a question. Of course, right? It's okay. Everybody's doing it. We're all doing it together. That's what's happening here. But over time, that really begins to fade. People talked about like, well, by Thanksgiving, people who didn't flood, they're moving on, right? Things were normal for them. So well before people who flooded were actually recovered, this like reaction of the community faded. And what happened within that was that all of this nervousness about being a person asking for help reemerged. So people were worried about being stigmatized for being people seeking help. It's not normal for their neighbors to be the people seeking help, and all of a sudden you're in that position. So it meant that as this like robust offers of assistance faded, the challenge of being a person still asking for help in that context emerged. And many people just wouldn't do it. even though the need was still present. So we find that there's this sort of temporal question that matters. And so there are ways that we have to think about what flood recovery looks like that both focuses on how policy is supporting people and what that looks like, but also how communities are supporting people and the ways in which our reactions and responses shape what is perceived as okay or acceptable when it comes to asking for help in the process of recovery.
I'm going to shift back to Dan now. Speaking of policy, so your book is fascinating by the amount of stuff in it. The number of policies you're talking about, the number of tendencies in the world of climate change, et cetera, that you're talking about, adds up to hundreds of different ways forward if you actually take it down to very specific areas. Now, if you take into account your challenges here, the subtitle is How Diplomacy, Technology, and Policy Can Unlock a Clean Energy Future. If you look at diplomatic coordination, the rate of change in technology, the prospects for policy production in the current environment, which areas of change fill you with the most hope?
I think I got the clearest answer to that only after writing the book, and had a number of opportunities like this and other forums where you have to figure how do I distill down, a 200-page book into shorter messages, and it came out most clearly when Rice students actually for the first time since before the pandemic put back together their TEDx club. So they put on a TEDx evening of 15-minute talks, and the theme this year was climate change. So they had me and another climate scientist, Sylvia D, did one, and to figure, and they actually had a business school student who was terrific, who's training to help CEOs and others do communication. She was my coach. I had to work harder for that talk than anything else. They needed drafts, they needed a video recording of a practice presentation, and the message that I realized came together that I don't think I put as clearly in the book, but that really distilled together across it was where I have hope, is that we're on this curve, we're at this cusp where so many of the technologies that we need are right at this tipping point. They're right at this point where they're becoming actually more affordable or better performing or somehow more attractive than the fossil fuels that they're replacing, and we can get to a different paradigm than this idea of doing less, that we've been so hooked on this idea of a carbon footprint that actually came out of the oil industry way of seeing things, where it's all about cutting back. How can I put on an extra sweater? How can I turn down the thermostat? How can I avoid flying? How can I do less in order to shrink the footprint? And I realized we need to reframe this of what do we build up? As engineers, especially in the civil engineering department, how do we build up? How do we create and construct the clean energy future that we want? And that's not going to come from us cutting back. We saw in the COVID lockdowns how much we can achieve by cutting back and doing less. Instead, where the hope comes is because the more that we adopt some of these technologies that are on the cusp, the more that we can drive down their costs, the more that we can make these clean technologies more affordable for the rest of the world. And that's where the hope really comes. It's not that we're going to shrink our way to this, but that we can get on this sort of learning curve. This curve, one of my favorite interviews was with the University of Wisconsin professor who wrote an entire book, How Solar Energy Became Cheap. And we need to do that with wind, with heat pumps, with geothermal, with battery storage, and so on. And the key is that it's within our hands. It's by being the early adopters, by getting it to the point with the research and development that is being funded, with the tripling of RPE's budget, with the purchases that are being incentivized, with the new bill that passed last year, the own decisions that we make, with the decisions that Rice University is making by upping its target and getting to net zero. The new target, I think, is 2030 or very early 2030s. That these decisions go beyond any individual footprint. They actually make it more affordable and make it possible so that other parts of the world can do like they did with phones, that they left over the landlines and went straight to cell phones. So can other parts of the world leap over the coal and oil that we built our economies upon and actually find that it's better, cheaper, more attractive, sexier to use other ways of doing things. And I see ourselves being at the cusp, but I think that's more empowering of what we can build, of how we can catalyze things that go around the world, rather than a framing of how we come.
One last question for Elizabeth. I want to end up with you, and maybe if there's one specific story from your book that you'd like to share with us.
Thank you. Yes. So I would like to share a story about a woman I call Patty. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about her life and take you to the particular story that she told to me in an effort to explain how the work is different, the work that she does.
Can you use the mic?
Oh, can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me now?
No.
You're close. Can you hear me now?
No.
Is it not on? How about if I project like a teacher? Yeah? Okay. So I want to talk to you about a woman I call Patty. She told me a story trying to help me understand how the work that she does as a nanny is different than other work. Patty is from El Salvador. She was 23 when I met her. She was the youngest of 4 children, and when she was 6 years old, her mother left the children with aunts and uncles and grandparents to come here to Houston, and her mother actually found a job as a nanny and still lives in the garage apartment of the family that she began working for. So Patty grew up for the next 17 years without her mother. She sent monthly remittances, cards, letters, phone calls. She was able to visit, I think, 6 times before the changes in border enforcement made it impossible to visit anymore. And in the end, Patty joined her other siblings and made the migration north and came to Houston to reunite with her family. And so all of this time, with her mother, all of this time her mother had been living this life here, and she had been working with this family that had 3 children as well. In fact, when her mother arrived, the youngest child in the family that she worked for, the oldest child in the family that she worked for was the same age, 6 years old, as her youngest child that she had just left, which even when I tell this story now, and I've told it so many times, just kind of catches me in the throat a little bit, because that's a hell of a choice. And over these 17 years, her mother had also been supporting the family and acquiring the capital and the cultural knowledge that she needed to sponsor the migrations of her older children and to find Patty a job as well as a nanny. And Patty's experience as a nanny had been beautiful, and she had fallen in love with the children that she took care of. 5 days a week, she lived in a garage apartment with this family as well. So the story that Patty told me, and it actually came out of a conversation she was having with her boss about being a working mother. And she tried to explain to her boss why she can't leave her children to be a nanny, but she thinks it's okay that her boss leaves her children to go work in an office because the work is different. Shortly after she arrived, her mother was taking her to work, but on the way, they were dropping off the youngest child in the family that her mother had been working for all this time. So this child had always known Patty's mother. And they arrive at the high school, and he hops out of the car, and he reaches in the driver's seat, and he gives her a little hug, and he says, "I love you, bye." And she says, "I love you too." She says, "Te quiero, mijo." And Patty is sitting in the passenger seat, and she's stunned, because she tells me she and her mother could not say, "I love you." And when she is telling me this, it's actually 7 years later than when it happened, and she just breaks down crying. And she says, "We try, and I know she loves me, and I know she was committed to me, but she wasn't there." They can't hug each other, they can't kiss each other. They don't say these words. But there's another side to this, because this was 7 years in, Patty having been absolutely in love with the children she took care of, and when she became pregnant for the second time and announced her pregnancy, she was let go, which is a story that I hear again and again as well. So she not only knew what she had lost with her mother gone, but she also knew what her mother had gained, because she had that with the children that she took care of, but it was completely circumscribed in a relationship in which she had very, very little power. So the work is different. And the thing is, the people who are most affected by it have the least power to change the circumstances. And I'm talking about the nannies, but I'm very much talking about the children. If you don't mind, I'm just going to throw a little coda of hope, because I really appreciated the hope that we had over here, which is when I brought this book to Patty, it was outside of her oldest daughter's, bustling middle school. She was so happy, and she looked at it and she said, "Can I put it on Facebook?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I don't know if you know, but sometimes we feel a little invisible." And she said, "I choose to do this work. I don't have to be a nanny anymore. I choose to do it. So thank you, for telling this story." So hope there as well.
Well, it's an amazing set of authors here. I'm always astounded hearing people who can speak in complete paragraphs without making corrections. I teach, I don't do that. So we have probably about 10 minutes for questions. If you have questions, that'd be great. I'd ask you please to keep them short. There'll be time to talk at the reception as well. But certainly we have time for a few more questions, if there are.
I have a question on the Friendswood community, which I'm familiar with. It's an Exxon community developed by Exxon. So did you look at what the career paths of these people were and relative to their opinions about the impact of climate change on their lives? And was there some correlation there as well?
That's a good question. So I didn't have a whole group of people in the sample who were Exxon connected. There were a really wide range of different kinds of professions represented, in part because Friendswood has seen a lot of change and sort of new generations of people moving in over time. It's a fascinating community in that it sort of has grown. Like it was a site of suburban development in the 60s and continued expanding in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s and today, right? There's this like growth of time. And you can see the affluence increasing in some ways. The homes get bigger and they go from sort of wood siding to brick to pools so there's this sort of variation in what it looks like in many ways across neighborhoods within the community. And some of the things we were interested in was whether sort of early folks who moved in these earliest periods were thinking differently than folks who had moved in much more recently. And some of what we see is that the variation in how we're thinking about middle classness is a little bit reflected in that sort of difference across earlier movers versus later. So some of the folks we spoke to who moved in to these homes as they were built, dollar down VA loan, moving in with families, doing things like working for the telephone company or being a manager for a construction company, things that we thought of as middle class jobs in that time period. And today, the families that are moving in are 2-earner, dual income households, lawyer, doctor couples. So the range and spectrum of what it looks like to be able to access this middle class space, I think, is changing. And so the range of people's sort of jobs, employment, and what that looks like is also changing. It's interesting because there are some differences then in the level of affluence and resources that people had to bring to the recovery process that also varied. So some of the oldest residents in the community who had been there since those homes were initially constructed sometimes had the fewest resources, and in the absence of flood insurance, they really struggled to recover their homes compared to some of the newer residents who had to spend more to buy into the community and then had more resources, and with flood insurance were often had a much easier time sort of navigating that recovery. So it's an interesting question, and we were thinking about people's employment and the ways that related both to their financial circumstances, but also to sort of how they were thinking about things. And maybe with the full sample of if we were able to survey and talk to every single person in Friendswood, we might be able to unpack that in more detail than we did, but I don't have specific stories related to that.
Could there also be a difference in just the ability to navigate the system?
Yes, I think that's an incredibly important factor to consider, and it's something that matters for broadly how we think about the way these policies are operating and who gets resources, right? So having the capital and the time to navigate systems matters a lot. Some folks had to go right back to work, and they might have had the capital to know how to navigate, but they didn't have the time. to be able to easily do that. Other people had both the capital and the time to know how to navigate, make all the calls, fight their insurance company for every dollar, and get more out of them to be able to facilitate recovery. So I think there were multiple factors that matter to sort of exactly what types of resources people get, and that the way we structure those systems and what the red tape looks like matters for who is able to access them. We also sometimes build assumptions into our policies in a way that can affect who has access to them. So I spoke to two sisters, both retired. One sister owned the home and the other was living with her and didn't really have a formal lease agreement. So the sister who was living in the household but not not an owner of the property really struggled to access any resources for all of her stuff that got lost because she wasn't like on paper anywhere that the system could say, like, you're a resident who lost stuff in this flood. So they were more reliant on only sort of one person's access to resources, even in their sort of two-person household, where they both had really severe losses of things that belong to them. So we have to think through how we build a system both in its accessibility and in the assumptions it makes about who's impacted that affects what people are able to access on the back end.
Any more questions? On the back, yes.
I'm very interested. I haven't read your book, so I'm just asking based on what I've heard here. Does your book at all touch on or think about how the current laws in effect impact those nannies and the families for whom they work, and how laws could be better to help nannies and the families who need them have a better relationship or better support than currently exists?
Sure. So my book doesn't talk about policy, but a couple of ways to answer that question. With respect to immigration policy, this idea that the productive value, the kind of social value of mothering labor is sort of dismissed as like this private kind of inconsequential women's work, has a very dramatic effect on policy, because it means it means an industry like this remains a shadow industry. So, for example, in the 80s and 90s, when immigration reform was being discussed, there was a lot of discussion about agricultural workers and construction workers, but there was very little discussion, with the exception of the Zoe Baird affair, about domestic labor. So on the one hand, one way to think about the relationship between laws and immigration policy and this kind of dynamic is to recognize that were the economic value of the labor itself built into broader economic policy and immigration policy, then we would see an acknowledgement, for example, of like family-based immigration as economically productive, right? Because we are literally creating human resources and divided families with a mother in Mexico, for example, taking care of children who will then come work in the United States. She's producing those human resources that benefit our economic system, or economy rather. But the other answer to your question is that there are laws that regulate domestic work, but many people don't even know about them. Even very well-meaning employers don't know that domestic workers, regardless of their immigration status, must be paid minimum wage. They must be paid time and a half, over 40 hours a week. They must be earning Social Security, regardless of their status. And it's very confusing for a lot of people. But there are other laws that don't apply to them, because there has actually been a tacit recognition of how important they are. So, for example, like OSHA, like occupational self, and I forget what that is, but laws about safety in the workplace, meals, rest breaks, snack time, those don't actually apply yet. So there are movements. There's a movement by the National Domestic Workers Alliance to adopt kind of a national domestic workers bill of rights that incorporates some of those. So enforcement of existing laws and additional laws as well.
We have time for maybe one more short question. Nobody dares to pose a short question.
I mean, in all these cases, it seems like the political dialogue becomes weaponized instead of developing an appreciation of the basis of the problem. And so how do we address that in each of the worlds? It's a short question.
Anyone want to respond, or is this what we take to the wine?
I have a very short response, which is I think telling stories is a really powerful way to demonstrate complexity in kind of a, without triggering. And so more stories, more asking for stories and hearing stories and telling stories. In my world, that's what
Well, I think we'll pull this to an end. I want to ask you to join me in thanking the honorees, and especially the panelists tonight. For great I have copies of the books which I read. You can't have them. I'll have them over at the reception, so if you want to take a look at them, you certainly can. Tonight's event was, we have to remember this. Tonight's event was presented by Friends of Fondren Library, a membership organization that provides financial support to Rice University's Fondren Library and presents lectures and events for our members and for the greatest Houston community. If you're already a member, please consider this your personal invitation to join. This is a group that I've worked with in one way or another for decades now, partly because the library, in my opinion, is the center, will remain the center of the university, no matter how it develops. We do hope you will join us for future Friends of Fondren Library events. This event information, as well as information on membership and so on, they're available on our website. We'll have membership information out there because you're not going to be able to avoid it. I would like to present a present to everyone here because, as we know, umbrellas are needed in Houston and they get destroyed very quickly. Thank you again, and I hope you join us across the way. Thank you.